The envelope in my mailbox looked official, stamped with the Willowbrook HOA seal, and I knew before opening it that my day was about to get worse. I pulled out the citation notice, my eyes scanning the formal letterhead before landing on the words that made my blood pressure spike. Violation of community aesthetic standards for unauthorized antenna installation. Fine amount $250. I stood there on my driveway in Norman, Oklahoma, staring at the paper like it might spontaneously combust if I glared hard enough. The antenna they were talking about was a simple weather alert radio antenna, barely 4 feet tall, mounted discreetly on my back porch where it was hardly visible from the street. Living in Tornado Alley made that antenna more than a decoration. It was a legitimate safety device that could save my life when severe weather rolled through, which happened with alarming frequency. My name is Peter Xander, and I had lived in this cookie-cutter neighborhood for 3 years without a single complaint. I worked from home as a software engineer, kept my lawn pristine, painted my shutters the approved shade of gray, and generally stayed out of everyone's business. The weather antenna had been up for 2 months, installed after a particularly nasty tornado outbreak in April that had destroyed homes just 10 miles south of us. The National Weather Service had issued warnings, but my regular radio had been buried somewhere in the garage, and by the time I found it, the storm was already passing. That near miss convinced me to get serious about weather preparedness. I walked back into my house, the citation crumpled slightly in my fist, and immediately pulled out my copy of the HOA covenant. The document was a thick stack of papers I had signed when purchasing the house, full of rules about fence heights, mailbox colors, and approved holiday decoration periods. I flipped through the sections on exterior modifications, reading each clause carefully. Satellite dishes were mentioned specifically as requiring board approval. Television antennas were prohibited, but weather safety equipment was nowhere in the document. The next morning, I called the HOA management office and got connected to Brenda Carmichael, the association president. Her voice came through the phone with that particular brand of chipper authoritarianism that made my teeth ache. "Mr. Xander, thank you for calling. I assume this is about the citation we sent regarding your antenna." "It is. I'm confused because my weather alert radio antenna isn't listed anywhere in the covenants as a prohibited item. All exterior modifications require board approval, which is clearly stated in Section 7.3. You installed this structure without submitting an architectural modification request." I pulled up the covenant on my laptop, scrolling to the section she mentioned. Section 7.3 specifically addresses structural changes like decks, sheds, and fencing. An antenna for emergency weather alerts hardly qualifies as a structural modification. The board has interpreted that section to include any visible exterior additions that affect neighborhood aesthetics. Her voice had taken on a harder edge, losing some of that false sweetness. "It's on my back porch. You can barely see it from the street. Several neighbors have complained about the unsightly appearance disrupting the visual harmony of our community." I leaned back in my chair, processing this information. My house was on a corner lot, which meant my back porch faced the side street, but it was still set back a good 30 feet from the road and partially obscured by a hedge. Someone would have to be actively looking for something to complain about to even notice the antenna. Who complained? That information is confidential. The point is, Mr. Xander, you violated community standards. The fine stands unless you remove the antenna within 7 days. If you wish to contest this decision, you may request a hearing before the board at our next meeting on June 15th. I thanked her through gritted teeth and hung up. The date was June 2nd, which gave me less than 2 weeks to prepare a case. I spent the rest of the day researching Oklahoma HOA laws and FCC regulations regarding antenna installations. What I found was interesting. The FCC had specific rules protecting certain types of antennas under the over-the-air reception devices rule, though weather alert antennas existed in a gray area. More importantly, Oklahoma state law required HOAs to have a legitimate basis for restrictions and prohibited rules that prevented homeowners from taking reasonable safety precautions. Over the next week, I compiled documentation. I printed out National Weather Service statistics showing Norman's tornado history, including the 5 EF3 or higher tornadoes that had touched down within a 20-mile radius in the past decade. I gathered information from the Oklahoma Emergency Management Office recommending weather alert radios with external antennas for optimal reception. I even got a letter from a local meteorologist explaining why these devices were crucial for safety in our region. June 15th arrived with typical Oklahoma summer heat, the kind that made asphalt shimmer and turned car interiors into ovens. The HOA meeting was held at the community clubhouse, a bland building near the neighborhood pool that hosted everything from yoga classes to birthday parties. I arrived 15 minutes early, my folder of documentation tucked under my arm, and found a seat in the back row of folding chairs. The room gradually filled with residents, most of whom looked like they would rather be anywhere else. Brenda Carmichael sat at a table at the front of the room, flanked by 4 other board members. Brenda was exactly what I had pictured, a woman in her early 50s with a severe blonde bob, wearing a blazer despite the heat, her expression suggesting she had been sucking on lemons. To her right sat Margaret, the vice president, a thin woman with oversized glasses. The other board members were less distinctive, their name tags identifying them as Robert, Susan, and James. Brenda called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of her gavel. The first 20 minutes crawled by as they discussed pool maintenance schedules, landscaping contracts, and an upcoming community garage sale. Finally, she reached my item on the agenda. Next, we have an appeal from Peter Xander regarding citation number 4729 for an unauthorized antenna installation. Mr. Xander, you have 5 minutes to present your case. I stood and walked to the front, acutely aware of the eyes following me. Thank you. I'm here because I believe the citation I received is based on a misinterpretation of our community covenants and potentially violates Oklahoma state law regarding reasonable safety measures. The antenna in question is for a weather alert radio, not for television or recreational purposes. In Tornado Alley, having reliable weather alerts can be the difference between life and death. I distributed copies of my documentation to the board members, walking them through each piece. The tornado statistics made several people in the audience shift uncomfortably. Everyone who lived in Oklahoma had a tornado story, a near miss, or a friend who lost everything. The covenant makes no specific mention of safety equipment, I continued. It addresses aesthetic concerns regarding recreational antennas and satellite dishes, but emergency preparedness devices serve a fundamentally different purpose. Oklahoma State Statute 37-306 requires HOAs to permit reasonable safety measures that don't substantially affect property values or neighborhood character. My antenna is 4 feet tall, mounted low on my back porch, and serves a critical safety function. Brenda's expression had hardened into something resembling stone. Mr. Xander, we appreciate your preparation, but the board's position is clear. All exterior additions require prior approval. You circumvented that process. I'm not disputing the approval process exists. I'm arguing that a safety device for weather emergencies should be categorically exempt from purely aesthetic restrictions, especially given our geographic location. Margaret leaned forward, her voice surprisingly sympathetic. Do other homes in the neighborhood have these antennas? I don't recall seeing any. Many people use weather apps on their phones, but those depend on cell service, which often fails during severe storms. A dedicated weather radio with an external antenna doesn't rely on cellular networks or internet connectivity. It receives direct broadcasts from NOAA weather stations. Robert, one of the other board members, cleared his throat. I actually remember the April storms. Power was out for 6 hours, cell service was spotty. My phone didn't get the tornado warning until after it had passed. Brenda shot him a look that could have frozen water. That's not relevant to whether Mr. Xander followed proper procedures. It's relevant to whether the procedures themselves are reasonable, I countered. If I had submitted an architectural modification request, would the board have approved it? The silence that followed answered my question more effectively than words could have. The board would have considered all factors, Brenda finally said, her tone making it clear the answer was no. But we'll never know because you didn't submit the request. The citation stands. Remove the antenna within 7 days or face additional fines. I felt anger rising in my chest, but kept my voice level. Then, I'm requesting a formal vote by the full board, not just a presidential decree. Let's see how many board members are willing to go on record saying a safety device violates community standards. Brenda's jaw tightened. Fine. All in favor of upholding the citation. Her hand shot up immediately, followed by James and Susan. Margaret hesitated, then abstained. Robert voted against. Motion carries 3-1 with 1 abstention. Meeting adjourned. I gathered my papers and walked out, feeling the weight of defeat but also a growing determination. This was far from over. In the parking lot, Robert caught up with me, looking uncomfortable. Hey, Peter, right? Listen, I think Brenda is being unreasonable about this. I've got kids and weather safety isn't something to mess around with. But she runs that board with an iron fist, and most of us just go along to avoid the drama. I appreciate you voting against it. Between you and me, Brenda has been on a power trip lately. Last month she cited someone for having their trash cans visible from the street 15 minutes past pickup time. This antenna thing is just her flexing because she can. I thanked Robert and drove home, my mind already working through next steps. If the HOA wanted a fight, they were going to get one, but I needed to be smart about it. That evening, I called a lawyer friend from college who practiced in Tulsa. Derek listened to my situation and let out a low whistle. HOAs can be a nightmare, but this one sounds particularly bad. You've got a decent case, especially with the safety angle and the lack of specific covenant language. Want me to draft a letter? Sometimes legal letterhead is enough to make these boards think twice. How much would that cost? For you, $200. I'll keep it simple, just outlining the legal issues and suggesting they reconsider. If it goes further, we can discuss actual litigation, but that gets expensive fast. I agreed, figuring $200 was worth it if it solved the problem. Derek had the letter drafted within 2 days, and I received it by email, printed it on proper legal stationery, and hand-delivered it to Brenda's house on June 18th. She lived 4 streets over in a house that looked like it had been decorated by someone who confused elegant with sterile. Everything was white and gray and meticulously maintained. She answered the door in casual clothes, but still managed to look severe. Mr. Xander, I didn't expect a personal visit. I wanted to make sure you received this." I handed her the envelope containing Derek's letter. It outlined some legal concerns about the citation and the board's interpretation of the covenants. "I'm hoping we can resolve this reasonably." She took the envelope like it might contain anthrax, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Threats of legal action. Really? It's not a threat. It's an explanation of why I believe the citation is improper. I'm trying to avoid actual legal action. The board has made its decision. If you refuse to comply, we'll continue assessing daily fines until you do. That's within our authority." Actually, Oklahoma law requires HOAs to provide written notice before assessing ongoing fines, and those fines have to be reasonable. But again, I'm hoping we don't have to explore the legal boundaries. Her expression could have curdled milk. "We'll see what our lawyer says about your lawyer's letter. Good day, Mr. Xander." The door closed with finality, and I walked back to my truck, wondering if I had just made things better or worse. The answer came 3 days later in the form of another letter, this time from a law firm in Oklahoma City, representing the Willowbrook HOA. The letter was full of legal jargon that essentially said, "Remove the antenna, or we will make your life miserable through escalating fines and potential legal action to force compliance." I forwarded the letter to Derek, who called me that evening. "They're doubling down. This is actually good for you in a weird way. If this goes to court, a judge is going to look at an HOA spending money to fight a homeowner over a safety device, and that's not a good look for them. But won't court cost me a fortune? It could. That's the calculated risk they're making. Most people back down when faced with legal expenses. But you've got a strong case, and I'd be willing to work on contingency if you want to pursue this. If we win, the HOA pays our legal fees. Let me think about it." I spent the next few days in a fog of indecision, going through the motions of work while my mind churned through scenarios. The 7-day deadline passed, and true to their word, another citation arrived, this time assessing a $50 per day fine for continued non-compliance. The letter stated that the fines would accumulate and could result in a lien against my property if left unpaid. A lien. They were threatening to put a lien on my house over a weather antenna. That was the moment I decided I was done playing nice. I called Derek and told him to file whatever paperwork was necessary. He started with a motion for declaratory judgment in Cleveland County District Court, asking a judge to rule that the HOA's citation violated Oklahoma law and that their fines were improper. The filing fee was $275, and Derek assured me we had a solid case. The legal process moved with the speed of continental drift. It took 3 weeks just to get a hearing date scheduled, during which time the HOA continued sending daily fine notifications. I stopped opening them after a while, just collecting them in a folder. According to their accounting, I now owed over $2,000. Our first hearing was scheduled for August 10th, a Thursday morning that dawned hot and humid. I met Derek at the courthouse, a modern building in downtown Norman that handled everything from traffic tickets to major civil disputes. We were assigned to Judge Patricia Morrison, who had a reputation for being no nonsense but fair. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with wooden benches and fluorescent lighting that gave everything a slightly sickly cast. The HOA was represented by Richard Stoltz, a lawyer in his 60s who carried himself with the confidence of someone who had been doing this for decades. Brenda sat behind him, her expression triumphant, like she had already won. Judge Morrison called the case, and Derek stood to present our motion. He walked through the arguments methodically. The lack of specific covenant language prohibiting safety equipment, The Oklahoma statute regarding reasonable safety measures, the disproportionate nature of the fines, and the FCC regulations that might apply. He presented my documentation about tornado statistics and emergency preparedness recommendations. Stoltz countered that the covenants clearly required board approval for exterior modifications, that the board had the right to enforce aesthetic standards, and that homeowners agreed to these restrictions when purchasing property in the community. He argued that allowing my antenna would set a precedent that would undermine the HOA's authority to maintain community standards. Judge Morrison listened to both sides, asking pointed questions that made it clear she had actually read the briefs. When the arguments concluded, she leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "This is an interesting case. Mr. Stoltz, your position is that the board has absolute discretion over aesthetic matters." "Within reason, yes, Your Honor. The covenants grant that authority." "And you're arguing that a 4-foot weather antenna on a back porch constitutes such a significant aesthetic disruption that daily fines totaling thousands of dollars are appropriate?" Stoltz hesitated. "The principle is what matters, Your Honor. If we allow one homeowner to bypass the approval process, others will follow. Mr. Holland, your position is that safety equipment should be categorically exempt from aesthetic restrictions." Derek stood. "Our position is that the specific facts of this case show the restriction is unreasonable. The device serves a legitimate safety purpose in a high-risk tornado area. It's minimally visible, and the covenant doesn't specifically prohibit it. The HOA is using a general provision about exterior modifications to restrict emergency preparedness equipment, which violates Oklahoma's requirement that HOA restrictions be reasonable and clearly stated." Judge Morrison nodded. "I'm going to take this under advisement. I'll issue a written ruling within 2 weeks. In the meantime, I'm issuing a temporary injunction preventing the HOA from assessing further fines until this matter is resolved. Mr. Xander is not required to remove the antenna pending my decision." It was a small victory, but felt huge. Brenda looked like she had bitten into a lemon as we left the courtroom. Derek was optimistic about our chances, though he cautioned that nothing was certain. The 2 weeks felt like 2 months. I obsessively checked the court's website for updates, refreshing the page multiple times daily. Meanwhile, life in the neighborhood took on a surreal quality. Some neighbors avoided eye contact when I was outside. Others, like Robert from the board, would give me subtle nods of support. One elderly woman named Patricia, who lived 3 houses down, actually stopped her morning walk to thank me. "I've been wanting to get one of those weather radios after my grandson nearly got caught in that tornado last spring. If you win this, maybe I'll put one up too." The ruling came on August 23rd. Derek called me at 9 in the morning, his voice excited. "We won." "Well, mostly." Judge Morrison ruled that the HOA's interpretation of the covenant was overly broad, and that safety equipment for weather emergencies constitutes a reasonable accommodation that must be permitted under Oklahoma law. She voided all the fines and permanently enjoined the HOA from preventing you from maintaining the antenna. I felt a rush of relief so intense it made me dizzy. That's incredible. There's more. She ordered the HOA to pay our legal fees, which I billed conservatively at $4,500. And she included language in the ruling that essentially requires the HOA to create a specific policy for emergency safety equipment, so this won't happen to other homeowners. Brenda is going to lose her mind, probably, but that's her problem. Congratulations, Peter. You stood up for yourself and won. I printed out the ruling and read it 3 times, savoring the judge's language. She had been scathing in her assessment of the HOA's position, noting that aesthetic preferences cannot supersede reasonable safety measures, particularly in a geographic region prone to severe and potentially deadly weather events. She pointed out that the HOA had failed to demonstrate any actual harm to property values or community character, and that their enforcement action appeared to be punitive rather than corrective in nature. That evening, I celebrated with dinner at a local steakhouse, treating myself to a ribeye and a good bottle of wine. I felt vindicated, relieved, and exhausted. The stress of the past 3 months had taken a toll, and I was looking forward to just living my life without legal drama. But I should have known it wouldn't be that simple. The first sign of trouble came a week later, when I received a notice about a special assessment from the HOA. Every homeowner in the neighborhood was being charged $300 to cover unexpected legal expenses and administrative costs. The notice didn't explicitly mention my case, but the timing made it obvious. Brenda was making everyone pay for the legal fees the HOA had been ordered to cover, and she was making sure everyone knew why. My phone started ringing with angry neighbors. Some were supportive but frustrated about the extra cost. Others blamed me directly for causing problems. One particularly unpleasant conversation involved a guy named Todd who lived on the next street over. "This is your fault, you know. We all have to pay $300 because you couldn't just take down a stupid antenna. The judge ruled the HOA was wrong to fine me. They chose to fight it rather than being reasonable. Whatever, man. You could have just avoided the whole thing. Now my kid's college fund is $300 lighter." I wanted to point out that $300 wouldn't even cover textbooks for a semester, but I bit my tongue. The animosity was spreading through the neighborhood, and I was becoming a pariah. Someone left a nasty note on my windshield calling me selfish. Another neighbor's teenager egged my mailbox. Derek advised me to document everything but otherwise ignore it. Harassment over a legitimate legal victory isn't going to help their case if they try anything else. But Brenda wasn't done. In early September, I received a notice that my lawn had violated height restrictions and was subject to a fine. I measured my grass, 2.7 inches, well within the 3-inch maximum specified in the covenants. I took photos with a ruler in the frame and sent them to the HOA office with a polite but firm email noting that the citation was baseless. 2 days later, another citation arrived, this time claiming my fence needed repair. The section they referenced had a barely visible hairline crack that had been there when I bought the house. I responded with photos showing that the fence was structurally sound, and that the minor cosmetic issue didn't violate any covenant provisions. A pattern was emerging. Brenda was using her position to harass me with frivolous citations, hoping to either force me out of the neighborhood or make me so miserable that I would stop fighting back. Each citation required time to document and dispute, creating a constant low-level stress that affected my work and quality of life. I contacted Derek again. "This is retaliation, right? There has to be something we can do." "Probably, but proving retaliation is tricky. We need to establish a clear pattern. Keep documenting everything, the citations, your responses, the timeline. If she's stupid enough to keep this up, we'll have a case for harassment." Brenda was indeed stupid enough, or perhaps just vindictive enough that she didn't care. Over the next month, I received 8 more citations for various minor or completely fabricated violations. My trash cans were visible from the street at the wrong time, even though I had security camera footage showing I brought them in within the specified window. My house numbers needed repainting, even though they were clearly legible. My mailbox post was the wrong shade of white, even though it matched the approved color from the HOA's own specification sheet. I disputed each citation with documentation, and each dispute was summarily rejected. The fines were piling up on paper, though I refused to pay any of them. By October, the HOA claimed I owed over $1,500 in various penalties. Then Brenda made a critical mistake. She sent a letter to several neighbors on my street, encouraging them to report any violations they observed at my property, and offering to waive their next annual assessment fee as a community service credit. One of those neighbors, a friendly retired schoolteacher named Francine Clark who lived directly across from me, brought the letter to my house. "I thought you should see this," Francine said, her expression apologetic. "This is wrong. She's asking us to spy on you and offering bribes." I've lived in this neighborhood for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like it. I read the letter, feeling anger and disgust rise in equal measure. This was beyond petty harassment. Brenda was attempting to orchestrate a surveillance campaign against me, using HOA funds to incentivize neighbors to manufacture violations. I immediately scanned the letter and sent it to Derek. His response was swift and excited. "This is it. This is exactly what we need. She's using her position to conduct a personal vendetta, and she's using HOA money to do it. We can file a complaint with the Oklahoma Real Estate Commission and potentially pursue a civil case for harassment. More importantly, this gives other board members ammunition to remove her." I followed Derek's advice and filed a formal complaint with the Oklahoma Real Estate Commission, which oversaw HOA management companies and board conduct. The complaint outlined the pattern of retaliatory citations following my legal victory, included the letter Francine had provided, and documented the financial burden Brenda's actions had placed on both me and the HOA. I also reached out to Robert, the board member who had voted against the original citation. We met for coffee at a local shop on a Saturday morning. He looked tired and frustrated. "I've been trying to rein her in," he admitted, "but Brenda controls the other board members. Margaret is spineless and James and Susan just go along with whatever she says. I'm basically powerless. What would it take to remove her? A vote by the full board, which won't happen, or a petition by 20% of the homeowners calling for a special election. In a neighborhood of 200 homes, that means we'd need 40 signatures. Would people sign after that special assessment? Maybe. A lot of homeowners are angry about the extra cost, even if they're also mad at you. If we can frame this as Brenda mismanaging HOA resources and creating unnecessary legal expenses, we might get traction." We drafted a petition over the next week, carefully wording it to focus on fiscal mismanagement and board overreach rather than the specific details of my case. Robert's strategy was smart. Make it about everyone's wallets, not about taking sides in my dispute. We needed 40 signatures, but we aimed for 50 to be safe. Collecting signatures was harder than I expected. Many homeowners were reluctant to sign anything that might create more drama. Others were afraid of retaliation from Brenda. But slowly, the numbers grew. Francine was instrumental, leveraging her 2 decades of neighborhood relationships to convince people this was about preserving property values and preventing future special assessments. By early November, we had 53 signatures. Robert submitted the petition to the HOA management company, which was legally required to schedule a special election within 30 days. The notice went out on November 8th, setting the election date for December 2nd. Brenda's reaction was predictable and explosive. She sent a letter to all homeowners claiming the petition, was part of a coordinated attack by troublemaking residents who refused to follow community standards. She accused me by name of orchestrating a campaign to undermine the HOA's authority, and warned that removing her would lead to chaos and declining property values. The letter backfired spectacularly. Her tone was so condescending, and her accusations so transparently self-serving that even people who had been neutral started questioning her judgment. Francine organized a community meeting at her house, inviting anyone who wanted to discuss HOA governance issues. 40 people showed up, cramming into her living room and spilling onto her back deck. I attended but tried to stay in the background, letting others drive the conversation. What I heard was eye-opening. Brenda's tyranny extended far beyond my situation. One couple had been fined repeatedly for their child's basketball hoop, which was supposedly creating noise disturbances during daylight hours. A single mother had been cited for parking her work van in her own driveway because commercial vehicles were technically prohibited. Never mind that it was just a regular van with her company's small logo on the door. An elderly veteran had been harassed about his flagpole height. Story after story painted a picture of an HOA president drunk on petty power, using her position to control and punish rather than serve the community. The meeting concluded with a consensus. Brenda had to go, and the election was the chance to make it happen. The campaign for the special election took on a life of its own. Robert emerged as the clear alternative candidate, presenting himself as a moderate voice focused on reasonable enforcement and fiscal responsibility. He promised to review all outstanding citations for legitimacy, create clear guidelines for safety equipment and reasonable accommodations, and operate the board with transparency. Brenda's campaign consisted mainly of fear-mongering about property values and warnings about letting anarchists take over the board. Her supporters were few but vocal, mostly people who had benefited from her selective enforcement, or who genuinely believed that strict rules were necessary to maintain the neighborhood's character. Election day arrived with unusual drama for what was basically a homeowners association vote. The turnout was unprecedented. Over 70% of homeowners submitted ballots, either by mail or in person at the clubhouse. Derek had advised me to vote but otherwise stay out of the spotlight, so I dropped my ballot in the box early and spent the rest of the day working from home, trying not to obsessively check my phone. The results were announced at 8 p.m. Robert had won with 62% of the vote. Brenda was out, effective immediately. The other 3 board members who had supported her also faced recall petitions, and while Margaret and James narrowly survived, Susan chose to resign rather than face the vote. I felt a weight lift that I hadn't fully realized I had been carrying. The fight was over, or so I thought. But December brought one final twist. On December 7th, I received a certified letter from the Oklahoma Real Estate Commission. Their investigation into my complaint had uncovered something significant. Brenda had been using HOA funds for personal expenses. The special assessment she had imposed wasn't just to cover legal fees from my case. She had been systematically overcharging for various expenses and pocketing the difference. The commission estimated she had embezzled approximately $15,000 over 2 years. The letter informed me that they were referring the matter to the Cleveland County District Attorney for potential criminal prosecution. They also recommended that the HOA pursue civil action to recover the stolen funds. I forwarded the letter to Robert, who was now serving as interim HOA president. He called me within an hour, his voice stunned. I knew she was controlling, but I never imagined she was stealing. What happens now? We need to have an emergency board meeting. This is way beyond HOA politics. We're talking about actual crimes. The emergency board meeting was held on December 10th. The new board voted unanimously to cooperate fully with law enforcement and to hire a forensic accountant to review the HOA's books. They also voted to void all outstanding fines against me and to issue a formal apology for the harassment I had endured. That apology meant more than I expected. It was one thing to win in court, but having the board acknowledge that I had been wronged felt like genuine vindication. Robert delivered it personally, showing up at my door with a copy of the resolution. "I'm sorry you had to go through all this," he said. "You were right to fight back, and I should have stood up to her sooner. You voted against the original citation. That took courage when everyone else was going along with her. Not enough courage, but we're going to make this right. The board is working on new policies about safety equipment and reasonable accommodations. We're also implementing financial controls, so one person can never have this much authority again." The criminal case against Brenda moved forward through the winter. I wasn't directly involved, but I followed the news through the neighborhood grapevine and occasional updates from Robert. The forensic accountant's report was damning, showing a pattern of fraudulent expenses and diverted funds dating back almost 3 years. Brenda had been clever about it, mostly stealing small amounts that didn't trigger immediate red flags, but it all added up. In March, Brenda Carmichael was arrested and charged with embezzlement and fraud. The charges carried potential prison time, though her lawyer was reportedly negotiating a plea deal. The HOA also filed a civil lawsuit to recover the stolen money, placing a lien on her house to secure the judgment. Watching her perp walk on the local news was surreal. This woman who had made my life miserable for months, who had weaponized petty rules and used her position to harass and control, was now facing real consequences. I didn't feel joy exactly, more a sense of closure. Justice wasn't always swift or satisfying, but in this case, it had eventually arrived. The HOA moved forward under new leadership. Robert served out the remainder of Brenda's term and then was elected to a full term by an overwhelming majority. True to his word, he implemented the reforms he had promised. The board created explicit policies exempting safety equipment from aesthetic restrictions, established financial oversight with multiple signatures required for expenditures over $500, and instituted a transparent appeal process for citations. My weather antenna remained in place on my back porch, a small but symbolic victory. During tornado season that spring, I received several inquiries from neighbors asking about the model and installation process. Patricia, the elderly woman who had thanked me during the legal fight, installed one at her house in April. So did 2 other families on my street. By summer, the neighborhood had largely returned to normal, though the memory of the Brenda era served as a cautionary tale. The new board focused on actual community improvement rather than petty enforcement, organizing neighborhood events, maintaining common areas, and addressing legitimate safety concerns. I had dinner with Francine one evening in late June, sitting on her back deck as the sun set and the Oklahoma heat finally started to break. She raised her glass of iced tea in a mock toast to surviving HOA tyranny and living to tell the tale. I clinked my glass against hers. "I would have given up if people like you and Robert hadn't backed me up. That petition made the difference." "You made the difference," she corrected. "You were willing to fight when most people would have just taken down the antenna and moved on." That took guts, especially when the whole neighborhood was getting hit with that special assessment. I'm still not sure if it was guts or stubbornness. Sometimes they're the same thing, but you did everyone a favor, even if some people don't realize it. Brenda would have kept getting worse if someone hadn't stood up to her. That conversation stuck with me as I reflected on the past year. The fight over a simple weather antenna had escalated into something much larger, a battle over the fundamental question of what HOAs are supposed to be. At their best, they maintain property values and create cohesive communities. At their worst, they become tools for petty tyrants to exercise control over their neighbors' lives. My experience had taught me that rules need to be reasonable, enforcement needs to be fair, and individuals have both the right and the responsibility to push back against overreach. It had cost me time, money, and stress, but I had won something more valuable than a court judgment. I had helped shift the culture of my neighborhood away from fear and compliance toward transparency and accountability. The weather antenna still stands on my back porch, 4 feet of simple metal tubing that caused so much trouble and ultimately sparked so much change. It serves its intended purpose every time severe weather rolls through, providing reliable alerts that don't depend on cell towers or internet connections. But it also serves as a reminder that sometimes standing up for a small principle can lead to larger victories. Brenda ultimately pled guilty to reduced charges in August and received 2 years of probation plus full restitution of the stolen funds. She sold her house in the neighborhood and moved away, which was probably best for everyone involved. The HOA recovered most of the embezzled money through the civil judgment, which helped offset the legal expenses from the previous year. Life in Willowbrook settled into a comfortable rhythm. The pool stayed open late on summer evenings. Kids played basketball in their driveways without fear of noise citations, and people generally left each other alone to live their lives. The board under Robert's leadership proved that HOA governance could be reasonable and responsive rather than authoritarian and punitive. I never set out to be a neighborhood activist or a champion of homeowners' rights. I just wanted a simple safety device to keep me informed during tornado season. But circumstances forced me to choose between backing down and standing up, and I chose to stand. That choice led to months of stress and conflict, but it also led to positive change that benefited the entire community. The letters from Derek's law firm still sit in a folder on my shelf, a paper trail of a fight I never wanted but don't regret. Next to them are the court rulings, the petition signatures, and the formal apology from the board. They document a journey from initial confusion over a citation to eventual vindication and reform. On particularly stormy nights, when the weather radio crackles to life with severe thunderstorm warnings or tornado watches, I sometimes think about how differently things could have gone. If I had simply removed the antenna to avoid conflict, Brenda would have continued her reign unchecked. The embezzlement might have gone undiscovered for years. Other homeowners would have continued suffering under arbitrary enforcement and retaliatory citations. Instead, my refusal to back down over a 4-foot antenna set in motion a chain of events that exposed corruption, removed a tyrant from power, and reformed an entire HOA's approach to governance. It sounds grandiose when I put it that way, but it's the truth. Small acts of resistance can have large consequences. My relationship with my neighbors improved significantly over time. Those who had initially blamed me for the special assessment came to understand that I wasn't the problem. Brenda's mismanagement and embezzlement were the problem. Several people apologized for their earlier hostility, which I accepted gracefully. Holding grudges would have been counterproductive when we all had to continue living in the same neighborhood. Todd, the guy who had yelled at me about his kids' college fund, actually became a friend. We started a tradition of watching Oklahoma football games together, and he later confided that his anger had really been about feeling powerless against the HOA's arbitrary authority. My fight had given him and others hope that they could push back too. The experience changed how I thought about community living and civic engagement. I had always been someone who kept to himself, paid my dues, and avoided controversy. But I learned that sometimes avoiding controversy means enabling injustice. Sometimes being a good neighbor means standing up not just for yourself, but for the principle that rules should be fair and enforcement should be reasonable. I also gained appreciation for the people who supported me when doing so was unpopular. Francine, Robert, and others who signed the petition or spoke up at meetings took real social risks. They could have kept their heads down and let me fight alone, but they chose solidarity instead. Their support made the difference between a lonely struggle and a successful community movement. Derek sent me a final invoice in September, tallying up all the legal work related to the case. Between the motion for declaratory judgment, the harassment documentation, and consultation on the criminal referral, his fees totaled $6,200. But because Judge Morrison had ordered the HOA to pay our legal fees from the original case, and because the new board voted to cover fees related to documenting Brenda's harassment as part of their institutional reform, I ended up paying only $800 out of pocket. That felt like a bargain for the principle established and the changes achieved. Money was never really the point anyway. The point was standing up for what was right and refusing to be bullied by someone who abused their position. Looking back now, more than a year after that first citation arrived in my mailbox, I can see the experience with clearer perspective. It was frustrating, stressful, and often infuriating. There were moments when I wanted to give up, to just remove the antenna and end the harassment. But I'm glad I didn't. The fight was worth it, not just for me but for everyone who lives under HOA governance and faces similar overreach. The weather antenna remains my quiet guardian against Oklahoma's volatile skies, but it's also a symbol of individual rights and community accountability. Every time I see it from my kitchen window, I'm reminded that ordinary people have extraordinary power when they refuse to accept injustice, even in seemingly small matters. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not over grand principles in dramatic settings, but over 4 feet of antenna tubing in suburban Oklahoma. Sometimes standing your ground means risking conflict, enduring stress, and facing criticism from neighbors. But sometimes that's exactly what needs to happen for communities to function fairly and for people to live freely in their own homes. My story isn't unique. Across America, homeowners face similar struggles with HOAs that overstep their authority or enforce rules capriciously. Many people don't fight back because the personal cost seems too high. I understand that calculus. I almost made that choice myself, but I'm grateful I didn't, because fighting back didn't just solve my problem. It solved everyone's problem and created a better community in the process. The Willowbrook HOA today bears little resemblance to the authoritarian regime Brenda ran. Under reformed leadership, it serves its intended purpose: maintaining common areas, organizing community events, and enforcing truly important standards while leaving homeowners free to live their lives. That's how it should have always been. My weather antenna stands as a testament to the power of one person's refusal to accept unreasonable authority. It's also a reminder that change is possible, that communities can reform themselves, and that standing up for principle can lead to victory even when the odds seem long. I still live in my house in Norman, still work from home as a software engineer, still maintain my lawn to keep it pristine. but I'm no longer just a quiet homeowner who keeps to himself. I'm someone who learned that community engagement matters, that speaking up can make a difference, and that sometimes a 4-foot antenna can change everything.